In July of 2020, not long after the murder of George Floyd by white police officer Derek Chauvin, the New Yorker magazine ran an article by Jill Lepore titled, "The Invention of the Police. Why did American policing get so big so fast? The answer mainly is slavery." In this article, she writes, "The crisis in policing is the culmination of 1,000 other failures. Failures of education, social services, public health, gun regulation, criminal justice, and economic development. Police have a lot in common with firefighters, EMTs, and paramedics. They're there to help, often at great sacrifice and by placing themselves in harm's way. To say that this doesn't always work out, however, does not begin to cover the size of the problem. The killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis cannot be washed away as an outlier. In each of the past 5 years, police in the United States have killed roughly 1,000 people in each of the past 5 years. During each of those same years, about 100 police officers were killed in the line of duty. One study suggests that among American men between the ages of 15 and 34, the number who were treated in emergency rooms as a result of injuries inflicted by police and security guards was almost as great as the number who, as pedestrians, were injured by motor vehicles. Urban police forces are nearly always whiter than the communities they patrol. The victims of police brutality are disproportionately Black teenage boys, children. To say that many good and admirable people are police officers, dedicated and brave public servants, which is of course true, is to fail to address both the nature and the scale of the crisis and the legacy of centuries of racial injustice. The best people, with the best of intentions, doing their utmost, cannot fix this system from within. If you think the topic of policing is inappropriate for church, I invite you to read the Gospels again. Jesus was all about speaking truth to power in order to claim that the unjust systems that caused harm and oppression for those not in power were against the vision God had and has for the world here on earth. Jesus used kingdom language which was intentional in order to establish the difference between God's vision and the vision of those who rule unjustly. Our focus for today is on the call for defunding the police and what it means. Next Saturday, we are hosting our 6th annual Vigil Against Violence, and the theme for the vigil is creating communities of safety for all. It's important to know that creating communities of safety for all is needed because in addition to other ways that communities are unsafe, we've been made painfully aware here in the United States over many decades how unsafe most communities are for Black people and for other people of color and indigenous people. One of the causes of the harm has been the actions by police officers against Black people in particular. Last year, our vigil focused on the movement toward defunding the police and how problematic that description is for the movement. Some people use the term defund the police as a way to claim that the police need to be abolished altogether. Others see it as a call to drastically reduce funding for the police, in other words, to divest resources for police, and to invest that money into communities and people. As we enter into some exploration and conversation in the next few weeks, I think it's important to reiterate what the article highlighted, which is that good and admirable police officers are on the force. But to focus on that is to deny the nature and scale of the legacy of policing. I was talking to a friend the other day who said one of her good friends became a Chicago police officer about 8 years ago. He is a black man who grew up on the edges of Cabrini Green, and he wanted so much to be a police officer in order to make a difference. He's gotten out of it altogether now because, as he told her, it's impossible to do the right thing in a system that at its core is racist. How can you have faith in a police force when 80% of those in the police union here in Chicago voted for the leadership of someone like John Catanzara? When you hear the terms defund the police or abolish the police, it's important to understand that at the heart of those movements and messages is a recognition that there is something fundamentally wrong and unjust about policing in the United States. And the system cannot simply be reformed, so it's time to envision something different. These movements recognize that each person should be treated with dignity and respect and given an opportunity to thrive. And policing in the United States will never allow for that in its current iteration. When we begin any conversation about policing, we should take a look at the history. From a New York Times opinion piece by Miriam Kaba, she says, "There's not a single era in the United States history in which the police were not a force of violence against black people. Policing in the South emerged from the slave patrols in the 1700s and 1800s that caught and returned runaway slaves. In the North, the first municipal police departments in the mid-1800s helped quash labor strikes and riots against the rich. Everywhere, they have suppressed marginalized populations in order to protect the status quo. So when you see a police officer pressing his knee into a black man's neck until he dies, that's the logical result of policing in America. When a police officer brutalizes a black person, he is doing what he sees as his job. Policing was established by a white government in order to protect white people and their property, and in order to control black and brown and indigenous people. It quickly morphed into a way for the rich and powerful to control those who would protest the treatment and conditions of the poor and working classes, which again skews toward people of color. In the Jim Crow South, police officers were part of the lynchings, and many belonged to the KKK. How do you reform something that from its very inception was designed to harm disproportionately poor people and black and brown and indigenous people? all signs point toward reform not being a viable option. In addition to the creation of a police force, however, we also have to look at the funding of this force in our conversations about defunding the police. To give some perspective on how police departments came to have such inflated budgets, listen again to Lepore in the New Yorker article I mentioned earlier. Quote, in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson declared a war on crime and asked Congress to pass the Law Enforcement Assistance Act, under which the federal government would supply local police with military-grade weapons that were being used in the war in Vietnam. Johnson's Great Society essentially ended when he asked Congress to pass the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, which had the effect of diverting money from social programs to policing. This magazine called it a piece of demagoguery devised out of malevolence and enacted in hysteria. James Baldwin attributed its irresponsible ferocity to some pale, compelling nightmare, an overwhelming collection of private nightmares. She goes on to say, in 1968, Johnson's new crime bill established the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration within the Department of Justice, which in the next decade and a half dispersed federal funds to more than 80,000 crime control projects. Even funds intended for social projects, youth employment, for instance, along with other health, education, housing, and welfare programs, were distributed to police operations. With Richard Nixon, any elements of the Great Society that had survived the disastrous end of Johnson's presidency were drastically cut, with an increased emphasis on policing and prison building. More Americans went to prison between 1965 and 1982 than between 1865 and 1964. Hinton reports, under Ronald Reagan, still more social services were closed or starved of funding until they died. Mental hospitals, health centers, jobs programs, early childhood education. By 2016, 18 states were spending more on prisons than on colleges and universities. Activists who today call for defunding the police argue that for decades, Americans have been defunding not only social services, but in many states, public education itself. The more frayed the social fabric, the more police have been deployed to trim the dangling threads, end quote. Here in Chicago, we've been hearing about the city budget for 2022. I'm a part of a group of faith leaders in the city who are crying out for a moral budget. What does that mean? A moral budget is one in which the values of the budget reflect the care for human life and thriving. As it stands currently, the police budget for 2022 is $1.9 billion out of a total budget of $16 billion. That does not even include the Office of Public Safety. According to a Tribune article, here are some other figures of money that the budget will allocate from federal relief dollars. $126 million for helping families through programs such as a monthly cash assistance program for low-income households. $103 million for health spending, including in-home services to new moms and victims of gender-based violence. $85 million for various violence prevention programs. $9 million on environmental spending. $65 million for youth programs. And $32 million aimed to help the homeless out of $16 billion and a little extra. We can hear then in our own Chicago budget the vestiges of what began under Johnson and continues today in terms of the long-term divestment from social programs and continued investment in policing, despite the fact that study after study has shown policing will not stop or even decrease violence or serve as violence prevention. What will make an impact on violence is investing in people and communities and mental health and public health services and education and jobs and affordable housing. Let's get to the heart of the matter. When we hear in this congregation, hear about the calls to defund the police, which includes divesting money from our militarized police forces and investing money in people and communities, what is our fear? When you imagine having a police force in Chicago that is half the size it currently is, currently we have 13,000 police officers, though we're down by 1,000, so on the streets we have 12,000. So say we were to cut the police force to 6,500. What are your specific fears? What do you imagine would go wrong? In the various conversations I've been a part of, and I've been a part of a lot of conversations, I've heard these fears expressed. Businesses and wealthy people will move out of the city, and there goes the tax revenue, and the city will be in real financial trouble. Gangs will take over the city. No neighborhood will be safe. The unspoken assumption in there is that right now, at least some of the neighborhoods are safe, and that's okay. More people will die from all kinds of violence. And lastly, property will be destroyed all over the city. Maybe some of those same things are fears that you feel. It's important, if we're going to be conversant in this conversation, that we identify our own fears, that we are honest about those fears, and that we're able to at least acknowledge them. This conversation is complicated on so many levels. There are people in neighborhoods all over the city, Black, brown, indigenous, white, people of Asian descent, who are on all sides of the issue. Sometimes the issue is divided by age, and sometimes not. What we all have to grapple with is that we have been taught, I would use the word conditioned, that a weaponized and now militarized police force is necessary in order to keep law and order. Do you think that's what the police do? In addition to the $1.9 billion this city spends on the police department, it spends hundreds of millions of dollars each year on settling or paying out lawsuits against the police. Imagine if those hundreds of millions of dollars went to neighborhoods and people and housing and jobs and the environment instead. It still wouldn't be enough, but it would help. As people of faith and as people who do our best to follow Jesus, we can look at what Jesus said about the militarized force in his own day, and then try to apply some of his teachings to the conversation about defunding the police in our day. Jesus was tortured and murdered for speaking out against the force in his day, and he was murdered by that force. Jesus would not tolerate the oppression and mistreatment of people who were poor or marginalized in any way. In almost every teaching that came out of Jesus' mouth, Jesus had something to say about caring for the most vulnerable and bringing people who were outcast back into community. Oddly, that included and includes loving our enemies back into their own humanity. How do we love militarized police back into their own humanity? What does freedom look like for those who are stuck in a systemically racist job and call to duty? What does freedom look like for those who are most at risk of being harmed by these very ones? Jesus wanted liberation for the oppressors and for the oppressed. Could defunding the police be a way toward liberation for both the oppressed and the oppressors? For whom would that be liberating? Amen.